Good afternoon. Um, it's my pleasure to invite all of you to the kickoff panel event of the Management and Social Justice Conversation, hosted by the New School for Public Engagement and Milano Management School. I would like to open this with a moment of silence for Tamir Rice, who would have turned 18 today. And it's particularly very personally affecting for me because my son turned 18 just last month. And it's just unimaginable to think that we live in a world that a child could die in a moment for no fault of his or his family's. And which is why, despite all the challenges, we decided that we would host this series of conversation, which was originally to be a conference in May. And being the epicenter in New York, we were kind of thinking about, should we do this or not do this? But we decided to go ahead and do it because I think the pandemic and the, what I would call the second pandemic with the race issues being so out and, engaging intersectionally everybody, that we really needed to host this conversation, and the New School is the right group to host it because our management programs are really grounded in our values of social justice and economic justice, racial justice, and ecological justice, and these are what make our programs a little different from other management programs. So with that, I would like to call for a moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. And today's panel is the kickoff event for this Management Social Justice series that will start now, and with twice a month events, workshops, demonstrations, roundtables, which is research roundtables by both practitioners, leaders from the community, and academic scholars and thought leaders from now until April. And with the hope that by next May, we would all be able to meet back in person in our beloved New York City, where we can all host you again for the second conference. And today's event is going to be moderated by my dear colleague, Professor Nidhi Srinivas. Nidhi is a specialist in nonprofit management and international development organization. And he does that work with the post-colonial and critical eye. And he has a book in contract with the Cambridge University Press on a critical take on international development organizations and NGOs. And so with this, I hand this over to Nidhi. Thank you, Nidhi, for doing this, and over to you.
Thank you, Latha. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first event in the Management and Social Justice Conversation series. My name is Nidhi Srinivas. I'm an associate professor of management here at the New School. Around us, wherever you are right now, you probably are feeling a sense of some crisis. Whether your attention is on the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States or elsewhere, the melting ice shelf and the declining forests in our planet, flagging economic growth rates, a global recession, levels of poverty and inequality across this world that have never been seen before in our history, or very simply put, the COVID-19 pandemic we're experiencing, which is making a lot of us remain locked down. Whatever it is, we are, it would seem, in a weird time. Something that once existed, something that seemed stable, something that seemed predictable, it appears to be slipping away. And we don't really know what will replace that stability. Perhaps something we don't quite understand is also emerging. Well, look, that's not me speaking, actually. That's me quoting Antonio Gramsci, the extraordinary Italian political thinker and activist, who in the 1930s said something very similar. Writing in his prison diaries, he said, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new has not yet been born." And he went on to say that during such a time, we will witness a variety of morbid symptoms. Well, we inhabit a time of crisis. I leave you to make a list of the particular morbid symptoms that attract your attention. I don't need to tell you, as a citizen of the United States living in New York City, that at least some of the morbid symptoms I might be looking at are in Washington, D.C. The original Italian, in Gramsci's words, is fenomeni morbosi. And if you look around you right now, ask yourself, what are some fenomeni morbosi that catch your attention? Well, look, can management actually speak about fenomeni morbosi, about these morbid symptoms? Should it? What would it look like if we actually engage with the social world around us and its crises using management concepts? Now, management is a complex term, and to different people, it can mean different things. There are places in this world, notably business schools, where management is still understood as being solely about profit, about getting results, efficiency, and little else. But as my colleagues in these business schools remind me, management is also seen as something else. And there is a huge interest in expanding and broadening the scope of what management stands for. We all know managers, students, activists who pursue goals of economic, social, ecological justice. They want to know how management can be about something deeper, something larger than a focus on only immediate workplace goals, getting a job done, meeting a deadline, and other forms of exigencies. How do we then speak about this bigger picture through management ideas? Today, we're very lucky. We have 4 scholars and activists who do precisely that. They look at a bigger picture and they exemplify as well as work through management ideas. Whether those ideas involve themes of economic injustice, ecological injustice, racial injustice, and epistemic injustice. The question we have agreed that we will discuss is the following. What is needed of management to ensure social justice? And we have agreed that by the word management, we can mean management theory, management scholarship, managers, management ideas. We've left it to the panelists to decide that. Each panelist will offer a short response to this question. And after these responses, we've agreed to generate a dialogue between the panelists, a reflective conversation on management ideas, activism, and social justice. We also encourage you to pose questions to these panelists. You can do so using the Q&A button on Zoom. These questions will be responded to in the final part of today's event. So let's now turn to the schedule. I'd like to introduce the first of 4 people who will be speaking to us. I have the great pleasure of introducing Paul Adler. Paul is the Professor of Management and Organization, Sociology and Environmental Studies at the University of Southern California. Late last year, his book, The 99% Economy, How Democratic Socialism Can Overcome the Crises of Capitalism, was published by Oxford University Press. And it makes a claim for the relevance of socialism for discussions of management. Paul, please.
Thank you. Oh, such a treat to be with you all today. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the participants who've joined us today. We're looking forward to a conversation amongst the panelists and with the attendees too, if we can. We'll hopefully have time for some Q&A and interaction there. But let me address the question that Nidhi put to us. I wanted to take seriously the ensure part of the question as he posed it. What is needed of management, scholarship, and managers to ensure social justice? And to answer that question, I think we need to step back and ask, what are the root causes of the manifold social injustices we see around us today? Class exploitation, but also domination in racial, ethnic, national, and gender hierarchies. And to cut to the chase, since time is short and we want to make sure everyone gets these different points of view into it, to cut to the chase, I think the root cause of all these social injustices lies in our reliance on a capitalist form of economy. And by capitalist, I don't mean anything particularly controversial. The bulk of what we consume is produced by privately owned businesses competing for profits. Workers are co-owners of these enterprises. They're employees hired and fired at the discretion of managers. And government's role in the production of goods and services and credit is largely indirect, supporting the private sector, not replacing it. And I think 4 things follow quite directly from any, for any society structured around an economy organized that way. Firstly, the people who own those productive resources, call them the business class, the capitalist class, the ruling elite, or whatever you like, those folks will resist at the bitter end any effort to end their exploitation of workers, because that's where their money comes from. And then I'd say second, this class draws great advantage from divisions amongst working people along racial, ethnic, national, and gender lines. Third, their economic power, the economic power of this ruling class translates into overwhelming political power. And then fourth, that means that struggles against exploitation and domination simply can't get very far unless we change the basic economic structure that we live with. So my thesis is simple, that it's only in a radically different kind of society, a democratic socialist society that I tried to sketch in my book, that we can hope to overcome social injustice. And by democratic socialism, I mean simply a society where we get to decide democratically on our economic, workplace, political, and so forth goals. And decide democratically not only in cities and enterprises, but also at the national and even international level. And again, I would say such a democratic form of control can't happen until we socialize the ownership of those resources, moving from a system based on private enterprise to public and cooperative enterprise. Such a society, I think, would pretty straightforwardly erase class exploitation. That doesn't mean that other dimensions of social injustice would magically disappear, but it does mean, I think, that the biggest and most important impediment to equality and to the abolition of social injustice would have been dismantled, and we could tackle those other sources of injustice much more effectively. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think one particularly provocative aspect of what you presented is we're actually at a time when governments are trying to help capitalist firms as well as consumers by giving them bailouts and different types of incentives. So it does seem in some ways a particularly relevant time to look at socializing capital. Thank you very much. Ana Maria Paredo is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. She's published many articles in leading journals, including on topics such as social entrepreneurship, community-based enterprises, and worker cooperatives. Ana Maria, it's really a great pleasure to have you with us. Thank you. Sorry, Ana Maria, you're on mute, so just unmute if you don't mind. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I really appreciate the efforts of the team at the new school for organizing this conference. So what is needed of management scholarship to ensure social justice is a big question. And I'm not so sure if we can ensure at this point. So we are faced with converging crises. We have known for a while that the way we live is exacerbating climate change, that the poverty and inequality we are creating with our economic system cannot continue. But we have been like the famous frog in the water with this crisis. The water is getting hotter and hotter, but we just get used to it, even as it gets close to the boiling point. And now all of a sudden we have COVID-19 and the massive anti-racism protests have increased the temperature, and we cannot ignore it. How are we going to get out of this boiling alive? We have to face the fact that the ways we conduct business is the problem. The current economic systems depends on exploitation of human beings and nature. We heat up the water. Those of us involved in management research and our education share responsibility. We have joined in normalizing and diffusing neoliberal ideology. The neoliberal ideology of capitalism, no steroids, super capitalism, behind this goes and challenges except for some critical scholarship. If we are going to contribute towards social justice, we have to take seriously stepping back and challenge the idea that the market system can solve everything. We need to decenter the myth of economic growth as the only way to human and ecological flourishing. We have to start questioning some other basic business assumptions, such as what is the economy, markets, profit motive, and the relationship between economic growth, poverty, and environmental justice, and trickle-down economics. Let's remind ourselves that the real economy is not just commercial markets. As management scholars, we need to bring into view new forms of business that are coming from civil society. I'm referring to enterprises such as cooperatives, common property enterprises, community-based enterprises, and indigenous worldviews that are guiding resurgence models and embedded economic practices. These enterprises are rooted in social movements and often not driven by profit models or based on private property. When it comes to markets, why do we join the assumption that the less regulation, the better? I recently read an editorial from leading management journal recommending against articles considering advantage of state-owned enterprises. The article said this is a waste of time and suggesting attention to the advantage of privatization. Why should we agree that letting self-interest be the only motivator for exchange to work well? I would say we have evidence that that's not true, and we have examples of other ways of doing business. Let's pay attention to the kinds of post-capitalist organizational forms that are emerging, particularly from civil society, social movements, in response and against the imperative of economic growth. Thank you.
Ana Maria, thank you very much. I think especially inspiring is both your call for socialization of capital in a certain sense, as Paul would put it, but also your attention to the environment and the stewardship of the environment by indigenous communities. You haven't mentioned it, it may come up later, but you happen to be in one of the most precious parts of Canada with a lot of forested landscape, which is still with indigenous stewardship, though that's under some threat. Thank you very much, Ana Maria. Erica Gabrielle Foldy is the Associate Professor of Public and Nonprofit Management at NYU, New York University. She's the co-author of The Color Bind, Talking and Not Talking About Race at Work. Her research focuses on social identity in and across workplaces. Erica, it's really a pleasure to have you here. And if I may say so, also as a fellow New Yorker, to have you here and to have Elizabeth here so that we can have some sort of commiseration at our shared solitude in these lockdown days. Thank you very much, please.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate being asked to be a part of this panel and have loved the pre-conference conversations that we've had. So there are others on this panel, Ana Maria and Paul, who have offered really useful and sweeping critiques of capitalism and neoliberalism. I'm going to offer a much more kind of narrow focus in responding to this question, but I really appreciate the context that they've set. And I'm going to speak to management scholars on the one hand and to managers on the other, just very briefly. So first of all, what do I think management scholars need to do to ensure social justice? I think we need to document inequality and injustice in all their forms. And to be honest, I think we're doing pretty well here. There's fantastic work by sociologists, by critical management scholars, and actually there's increasing work by people in organizational behavior and organizational psychology that I think actually offer really, that document inequality in many really important ways. Of course, by far the bulk of management scholarship takes for granted current organizational forms. But overall, I think that the amount of research that documents inequality is growing, and I think it's very, very useful. Secondly, I believe that we must ruthlessly critique mainstream management approaches, and we have to offer practical solutions. So I think it's very common for critical scholars to focus only on critique. And I understand that because any kind of organizational change is almost inevitably going to be co-opted and corrupted by people in power. And yet I also feel that if we don't enter the fray, then we abdicate responsibility for organizational change to mainstream consultants and to mainstream scholars. And then we wonder why nothing ever changes. So I really encourage critical management scholars to enter the fray, get our hands dirty, and try to make organizations better even as they are right now. And finally, I really encourage management scholars to engage in activism, whatever form that might take. We need to get out of the ivory tower. In terms of managers, I want to speak specifically around race and racial justice because that's where the bulk of my work is. I feel, first of all, that organizations, managers, executives need to name race and need to name racism, and we need to stop hiding behind this notion of diversity. Whenever I say that, I know immediately people say, what about gender identity? What about sexual orientation? What about intersectionality? I completely agree with all of that. And I would say that I still think this is the time to focus on race and racism. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, race is the single biggest predictor of life chances and life outcomes, at least here in the United States. And we have a moment right now where I think we can make progress related to racial justice. So I do encourage us to keep that focus. Secondly, if we really want to make change towards racial equity, organizations, managers have to work at multiple levels. At the individual level, that's often critiqued. Diversity training, we've had enough of that, doesn't work. Generally true, but that's because it hasn't been done in concert with work at the cultural and structural levels as well. People create cultures and structures. Those aren't going to change unless the people change. So I think individuals, particularly executives, have to take responsibility for how they're contributing to the problem and try to change and become part of the solution. Cultural change. Organizations send cues all the time about who belongs and who doesn't. The whole notion of professionalism is imbued with whiteness. How we dress, how we speak, how we run meetings. I think organizations have to recognize those cultural cues and do their best to eliminate them. And then finally, structural change. People talk about it a lot. What does that actually mean? Here's one example. If organizations started recruiting on the basis of skills-based hiring rather than qualifications, so instead of looking at whether someone went to school, what school they went to, instead look at whether they can do the job, that would be a change. That would be a structural change in how organizations work. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of this or to move further, but thank you for this chance to make a few comments.
Erica, thank you so much. I find your comment on professionalism really wonderful because you're reminding us that professional models of management or of how managers are meant to behave are imbued with our notions of race supremacy as well as heteronormativity in many senses. And I think one important aspect of what you stated